I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm Paul Kelly. I'm the founder and clinical director here at the Mindfulness Clinic, and we're pleased to offer a space for Dr. Davidson to come and meet some of the professionals in town who do mindfulness work. And he's here for the premiere of a film about his work this evening, and he'll speak more about that. I'll just say I've followed his work since I was an undergraduate when I had hair. And thank you, yeah. And it's so important that Western science has worked with these Asian traditions to both bring forward and translate the wisdom from those traditions and to help us take it further here for the work that we do with our patients. So I'm very pleased that you've done the work you've done and that you're here today to meet some of us. And thank you for coming to welcome him to Toronto. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here and to meet this group especially. So I'm very pleased that we were able to arrange this. What I'll do is just share with you a few tidbits about our work and say a few things about the film, which is what brings me here to Toronto today. And then also be very happy to answer any questions that you might have. So I am, just by way of autobiography, a psychologist and neuroscientist by training. And I had the great fortune very early on in my career to meet some remarkable people. These were people whose presence and whose demeanor was very infectious to me. And I learned that one of the things they all had in common was an interest in a practice of meditation. And that led me on a journey, which I'm still very much on today. After my second year of graduate school, I went off to India for the first time to get a taste of what these practices were about myself. And that's when I actually sat in my first meditation retreat in 1974 in the Himalayas with a very well-known Buddhist meditation teacher named Goenka. I'm sure some of you have heard of him. And I came back to graduate school. I was a graduate student at Harvard with a strong aspiration that this was going to be my life's work. And it was made very clear to me by the faculty there that this was not a very good way for me to begin my scientific career. And they encouraged me to pursue something that was more mainstream. And so I was a very dutiful student, and I was very interested in emotion and still am very interested in emotion in the brain, and very much see the work that we do on meditation as part of this larger picture. Because one of the ways in which meditation transforms the mind and the brain is by transforming our emotional response, by really producing enduring qualities of well-being, of equanimity, of happiness. These are all emotional qualities. And so my lives became integrated because for many years after my initial encounter with my professors in graduate school, I sort of went underground with my interest in meditation and became a closet meditator for 20 years. And all that changed in 1992 when I met His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And His Holiness encouraged me to investigate changes in the brain that may be produced in Buddhist monks and other long-term practitioners who spent years cultivating their mind. And His Holiness challenged me, and he said, look, you've used the tools of modern neuroscience to study qualities like fear and anxiety and depression. Why can't you use those same tools to study kindness and compassion? And I didn't have a good answer. You know, it's hard to do that, but it was hard when we first began to study fear and anxiety. And I made a commitment to His Holiness on that day in 1992 that I was first going to come out of the closet, and second, that I was going to do everything I could to put kindness and compassion on the mainstream scientific map. and begin to do serious neuroscientific research on these topics. And then we, in fact, started to do that, and it took us a few years to ramp up, but we now have a very vibrant program of research with lots of different projects going on. And then I was contacted by Fee Ambo, sort of cold contacted. She had been surreptitiously stalking me and listening to talks that I was giving. And she came to me with a proposal to make a documentary film. And as most scientists, in response to a request like that, my knee-jerk reaction was to say no. That, you know, I knew what kind of demands journalists and filmmakers make, and my initial disposition was not very positive, but she wanted to come meet with me and just talk to me, and there was something about the initial contact that said, well, I'll have a 1-hour conversation with her and see where this goes. And so we met, and there was something about Fee that really made me feel extremely secure, and that this was someone that I could deeply trust. And I must say that I've never done this with any other journalist or filmmaker. We provided just unprecedented access to everything, and literally there was nothing that was off limits, and it was because of a fundamental trust, and my instincts, I think, were totally right, because I just am overjoyed with the product, and I think that it's a very powerful film, and I never envisioned that the product would be as amazing as I think it really is. And it's my fervent aspiration that this film will just go totally global and will help to promote a kind of transformation that I have been dedicating my life to achieving. One of the things that I'm acutely sensitive to as a practicing scientist is that although I think the science that we do is extremely cool and rigorous and absolutely necessary and important, it's not sufficient to produce the kind of global change that we all wish and aspire to make. And I think that that the kind of documentary film that Fee has made is going to be enormously catalytic in promoting this kind of awareness, which is going to be the key to incorporating these practices into the mainstream. And I think that the film features two of the most important domains of our culture where these practices can and should be incorporated into the mainstream. One is education, and the other is healthcare. And those are two domains which are just ripe for these kinds of practices. Both of these domains are becoming much more concerned about evidence-based practices, and this is, I think, primed for incorporating. And so that's really an introduction. I'd be happy to share any details about specific research projects that we're doing or anything else, but maybe I'll pause here and just get a sense of the audience and see where you guys wish for me to take this. So let me stop there. And Fee, do you want to say anything at this point? This is Fee Ambo.
No, I just want to say that the funny thing that we experienced sometimes was that you all know as practitioners that these methods have an enormous effect, that sometimes it's actually very hard for people to believe how powerful they are themselves and the tools that we have inside ourselves. So if you go see the film tonight, I think we'll probably get some questions in the audience like, is this really true? Is this really, can these kind of changes really happen so quickly? So that's been kind of interesting to see that that it's so surprising that that you can make such a big difference yourself by doing these really secular breathing things and.
One of the comments that I sometimes get when I talk about the research that we've done with very long-term practitioners, people who have spent tens of thousands of hours practicing, is that they say this is all interesting and exciting, but this is not applicable to anyone that I'll ever come in contact with, or myself. That I'm not going to remotely approach that number of hours of practice. And we have a paper just about to come out. It's going to come out in the next week or two. It's on a simple compassion meditation practice showing that 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks among individuals who've never practiced before can actually produce robust, discernible changes in the brain and changes in behavior. And this is after a total of 7 hours of practice, 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks. So it underscores how available this is. We all have minds that are capable of this. And actually, in the original Sanskrit, the word meditation means familiarization. It's already, all this stuff is already in us. We just need to look at it and become more familiar with it. Wake up to the fact that it's there and it can then flourish.
For those who aren't attending this documentary tonight, how will the world access it?
Well, Sigrid, maybe you can say something about the Canadian distribution.
Yes.
Because Sigrid is a
I'm the
producer of the film.
And the film, you were saying the world, but in Canada the film will premiere in the cinema from the 7th of June. And right now we've planned it to premiere in 10 cities around Canada. And tomorrow we are opening up the film in New York. And it's going to be out in the US at least in 7 cities, but we also have more cities coming up now, so we hope it's going to be around 15 cities. And it is premiering in 60 cities in Germany.
Wow.
In the cinema, and it's been in Denmark in 80 cinemas, cities, and also on Greenland and Faroe Islands. And we did live Q&A that was including Greenland and Faroe Islands, so that was a pretty large extent. Yeah. And then it's been out on the festival circuit, we call it. It premiered in November in Amsterdam, and it's been now on 5 festivals, and here in Hot Dogs is the first North American premiere. So it will get around the world somehow. And also when we go on VOD and DVD, there's a much bigger possibility to get the film around. But it's also premiering in Netherlands on DVD and in all of Scandinavia on DVD and VOD.
Well done.
But we actually have now felt a big need for the educational sector to get the films to schools, university, college, stuff like that. So that's really a place we could all promote, because we can get the film out to them, and they seem like they want to use it. So it's really nice. We'll get the message out.
So, other questions?
What's new from your book? I enjoyed reading it immensely.
Thank you.
Richie. In fact, you signed it a year ago at the last Mindfulness Conference, and I'm quite sure you've had some terrific response. But is there a follow-on from it?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of research that is going on in our lab, so we're continuing on many different fronts. In the film, most of you haven't seen the film yet. The film depicts 2 major research projects. One is work with preschool children, where we have developed a curriculum that is based on mindfulness and kindness practices, but age appropriate for preschool kids. And we are formally evaluating that in the context of a variety of rigorous research projects. And we're now deploying that in the Madison Public Schools in Madison, Wisconsin. We're working now with this academic year with about 200 preschool kids, and next year we'll work with a comparable number. So we'll have much larger sample sizes, and we're getting all kinds of additional measures. And we're also continuing to work with veterans and working with, so the second research project that's featured in Fee's film is work with veterans who are going through an intervention that's based on some simple breathing practices. And these are veterans who were in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we're continuing to work with vets. We're actually working with vets who are even more severely affected and who have, in many cases, really severe post-traumatic stress syndromes. And we're interested in particularly exploring which kinds of practices may be best for which kinds of people. So those of you who've looked at my book know that I've talked about different emotional styles. And one of the conjectures that I have is that this really applies to meditation too. Not one size was not going to fit all. There's not going to be one kind of practice that's going to be best for everyone. And we don't yet know how to figure out which kinds of people will benefit from which kinds of practices. And so that's a theme in a lot of our work going forward is, and actually developing ultimately a clinician-friendly toolkit that actually could be deployed in the field that can provide some useful information about what kinds of practices may be most effective for which kinds of people, based upon an assessment of their emotional and cognitive styles. So that's happening. We've also have a lot of very basic research that's going on. We have researched some new work that's showing that 8 hours of meditation, mindfulness meditation practice can actually change gene expression. It's the first time that that's ever been shown. We're going to be submitting the first scientific paper on this in the next month or so, and we believe that the implications of this are really profound, and this is going to, I think, open up a whole new domain of research. So in terms of books, I'm actually writing a book now with Dan Goleman together that will be a kind of joint autobiography and a history of the emergence of contemplative neuroscience. And it's really going to be about altered traits of consciousness, that is, ways of transforming consciousness in an enduring fashion.
Is there any potential for rapprochement with great religious traditions so that this can also enter into contemporary Christianity and Judaism, for example?
Well, you know, the Dalai Lama wrote a beautiful book called Kindred Among Faiths, and it's a book about major world religions. And His Holiness asked us, us being the Mind and Life organization, to organize a meeting that was held in India a couple of years ago that involved all of the major Indian religious traditions. To help to identify certain common themes that cut across these different religious traditions, particularly emphasizing the kind of contemplative underpinnings. So I think that there is real hope, but also...
Have you been approached by anyone from the Christian or Jewish?
Sure. Yeah, lots. And we've done, you know, various things with leaders in Christian contemplatives, Father Thomas Keating, Brother David Stendelrath, and also some Jewish contemplatives and some Muslim contemplatives. So, you know, I think that there really is possibility, and but you know, His Holiness has also been very strongly pushing this idea of secular ethics, the notion that we can take from these traditions strategies and methods and develop them in a way which is completely secular, not in the sense of being anti-religious, but in the sense of being acceptable to an individual from any religious traditions. And so that's something that a number of us are also working on. Sure, thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, I was at the conference in Denver also about a year ago, and you gave a talk there at the end and basically said, you know, this all sounds wonderful, but really we're still in the early stages. The NIH is not convinced, and I'm just wondering if you can comment on sort of the progress in the last year.
Yeah, well,
non-meditator authorities.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that. This is a question about a meeting that was held about a year ago in Denver, which was the first international symposium on contemplative science. And it was organized by the Mind and Life Institute. It was sponsored by a number of people. And so, you know, I knew that I was preaching to the converted, and so this was a particular audience, and I wanted to convey a particular message, which is, guys, you know, the world out there is not who is sitting in this room, and the same applies here. And so what I was referring to is the NIH issued a report. They actually commissioned a report that was published in 2007. So it's now, you know, a number of years old, but the report evaluated the world scientific literature on the impact of meditation on health. And the conclusion in that report in 2007 is that there was no credible evidence that any form of meditation had any health benefit whatsoever. It's a very sobering message, and the reason why the report was so negative is because the scientific studies have, for the most part, been really pretty flimsy, not very rigorous. And so we need much more rigorous scientific evidence, and it's going to take a while. It's not something, so there's been progress this year, but it's going to take more than a year, and we need more scientists who are interested in studying this, and frankly, we need more support to do this kind of research. You know, the United States government funding agencies are barely functional these days. So it's going to be a challenging climate the next few years, particularly for young people. Theo.
Yes, are you planning to distribute or replicate your program for kindness with pre-K to grade 2, is it that you said, to other districts, or are you just going to keep it within those?
Our aspiration is to do this in a big way, but we only want to do it in a big way if it's done in the context of rigorous research. So we would love to replicate this in many different cities, and we feel the need to do it in many different cities with a much larger sample size, with a much more diverse sample. So I'm envisioning a study that involves somewhere around 6 different cities, at least in North America, where we do this.
Well, you should consider Toronto, because from our experience in high schools and the districts that we've reached out to, they're all asking the same question. We want age-appropriate content starting kindergarten.
Yeah.
And it's yet to surface.
Yeah, well, we'd love to do it. So, you know, I think it'll happen at some point in the not-too-distant future. We need to put together a variety of different funding sources to allow this kind of research to go forward. But it really needs to be done with multi-cities, multiple investigators in a very collaborative way. That's definitely, you know, something that we're actively agitating toward. I should also mention that we're also thinking about very unorthodox ways of doing this with kids who are a little older. We recently received funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to develop games that are right now implemented on tablets. Games to cultivate, a separate game to cultivate empathy and pro-social behavior, and another game to cultivate mindfulness. And these games are, they don't look like games that academics develop. They are professionally designed games. And we're now doing a very serious neuroscientific evaluation of those games. So kids are going to be randomly assigned. We're recruiting kids right now. The age group that this is focused on is middle school kids. You know, if this is helpful, then the possibility of dissemination is obviously extraordinary. So it's something that we feel is very much worth exploring.
Can you talk a little bit, are these all clinical trials in the sense that you a reference group as well?
Yes, they're all clinical trials in that sense. In that sense, yes.
So what's the difficulties you run into in terms of the applied research? I mean, if you're researching out in the community, whatever, how do you control for the kinds of issues that might, complications that might?
I'm not sure, well, of what sort? What sort of complications?
How do you keep your samples equivalent, for example? How do you maintain that what is seen as clinical trials?
Yeah, well, you know, for the work we're doing in the schools, we randomize by classroom. And so we're using kids from the same schools, and they're randomized either to our curriculum or to an alternative curriculum.
So there's not a no treatment in that sense?
We also have a no treatment group. So most of the studies that we're doing have 3 arms. There is our experimental group, there is an active comparison group, and there's a no treatment arm. So yeah, I mean, these are difficult, complicated, and costly studies to implement.
Well, that was my other question, I guess, was do you have other...
But let me say also that that this is the way it has to be done to really do it right. Yeah.
No, the other question was, given what you had said about the fact that the sources from NIH or other government agencies are not all that reliable, are there other opportunities like the Gates Foundation?
You know, we're exploring every opportunity that we learn about. So if you guys know of opportunities, please send them our way. And we'd love to have Toronto be a site. I think there's clearly a lot of interest and opportunity in the city. So, and we have lots of friends here, so it's great. Yeah.
I don't want to be crass, but I mean, how much money does it cost to do a typical study?
Just to give you a sense of scale, to do this in 6 cities with the sample sizes that I'm talking about, with the kind of measures that I'm talking about, would be about $15 million over the course of 3 to 4 years.
And that's with something like 1,200 kids, or?
More than that, yeah. Yeah, it would be more than that. But that's the kind of effort that's required to do this kind of work right. Yeah. But the cost savings on the other end is, you know, we can actually demonstrate that it's a wise investment.
How long would the actual period be where you're actually giving people the meditation practice?
Well, you know, that's a great question, and the honest truth is we don't know. The kindness curriculum that we're doing with preschool kids right now is designed as an 8-week curriculum where the classroom exposure is 90 minutes a week in 3 30-minute sessions. Those are arbitrarily picked. I mean, not completely arbitrarily. They're certainly based on other things that we and others have done, but they're guesstimates, and that has never been systematically studied. One of the things that I'm increasingly convinced of, both from my own practice as a practitioner and also from doing research is that short periods of practice that are done very frequently is probably something that we're going to need to move to with very young children. And I'm thinking about really short periods of practice. So if we, for example, had a child do 3-minute practices 7 times a day over the course of a school day, there's a lot of reason to believe that that's going to be more effective than a single exposure of 20 minutes. Based upon what we know about the brain, based upon what we know about these kind of practices, and based upon the interest in blurring the distinction between a formal period of practice and everyday life. Because after all, we're all interested in what the after effects of these practices are, not how kids feel when they're actually doing them, but they're only going to be useful to the extent that they transform a person in her or his everyday life. And so, but this has never been directly studied scientifically.
Fascinating thing is the parallel with exercise physiology, which has now concluded it's much better to go like stink for 2 minutes and have a high intensity interval training is better for you than walking at a moderate pace for half an hour.
Right, right. And actually it's interesting that you mentioned that, because there are studies at the animal level which suggest that promoting neurogenesis in the brain, which is a major mechanism of plasticity that involves the actual growth of new neurons, is facilitated most by exactly that kind of interval regimen, not by continuous practice. And so, you know, these are all scientific tidbits, but they haven't been formally explored in this realm, but they need to be.
So if you were to take what you know now, and if you were to make a recommendation to an individual person, whether it be an adult or an adolescent, say, or even a child, what would you recommend as a regular kind of practice?
I would absolutely resist the urge to offer any recommendation that would be applicable to a child in general or to an adult in general. Okay. And I think that... What would you offer? You know, I would find out more about who that person is, and you know, there are, my own experience is that there are some people who, because of their emotional and attentional style, could sit down and, quote, meditate for 30 minutes and spend the vast majority of that time mind-wandering, and actually have it exacerbate certain kinds of tendencies, and actually not only not be helpful, but may be detrimental. And for that person, it may be much better to have 3 minutes of practice and tell them you absolutely should not meditate for more than 3 minutes before you get up and do something else. And so I don't think we really know enough yet to, I mean, I would do certain things to where we can assess their cognitive and emotional style, and this is sort of what I was referring to earlier, but this is going to be, it's sort of like personalized medicine. But applied to contemplative practice. And for other people who have more stable attention, you know, sitting for even 2 hours is great, and their minds are stable, and they're not getting lost in mind wandering, and that would be fine. So I think we really have to be sensitive to these individual differences.
You just answered my first question. You're leading into my second. I'm wondering, in your research, do you inquire about what people are doing during their active periods of meditation, and one where they're doing, say, 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks? So I'm wondering about that piece. You know, if some people are actively sitting and following their breath. Or...
Well, in this particular experiment, we actually guide them every minute of the way. So it's totally guided for the whole 30 minutes. So their mind can be somewhere else still. And my own conjecture is that for people who are just starting to practice, it's not very helpful to ask them about where their mind is, because they don't know where their mind is. With experienced practitioners, it can be very helpful. But with beginning practitioners, not so helpful. We have other ways of probing the mind and the brain that don't rely on what a person says about what they're doing, that we think are more valid in the early stages of practice. All of this is different in long-term practitioners. in long-term practitioners, we're really interested in what they have to say because they, this goes back to the comment I made about the word meditation means familiarization in Sanskrit. And so long-term practitioners are just extremely familiar with their own minds, and they can report with tremendous subtlety and granularity what's going on. And there the descriptions are terrifically helpful. So one of the conjectures is that as people progress in practice, the correlations between what they say about what their mind is doing and other objective indices are going to be much more closely coupled, whereas in beginning practitioners, what they say about what their mind is doing and our objective measures are going to be pretty much unrelated, which is exactly what we find. Yeah.
Just wondering about things like biofeedback devices, and if you've done any work with them, and I have no idea where they're at these days, but I'm wondering if you think this is the future of meditation, or
yeah.
what
Actually, this wonderful student, what is your name?
Ishan.
Ishan asked me this earlier. He's a student at McGill and was interested in this. My own view is I'm skeptical. And I'm skeptical because it presupposes that we know what biological measure to feed back. So if someone tells me that they're going to use biofeedback or neurofeedback to help cultivate these qualities, I say, well, tell me what you're measuring. Because there's nothing I know of that I would be comfortable actually feeding back to a person, because one of the things I try to work with my students about is to cultivate humility. We actually know so little about what's going on. And to think that we can actually feed back a physiological signal and have it have meaningful effects at this stage of the game is just so way beyond what we know. And I worry about detrimental consequences. And I also think that it will potentially interfere with a person's ability to develop his own internal sensitivity to what's going on. The best feedback that we can get is to listen to our own minds and bodies, I think.
So in that...
Theo, yeah.
If you had one dream you would like to see manifest, I don't care how long it would take, what would that be? In your field or, related to your work, what would that be?
Related to the work, to my work? Well, I would say, I sort of have two parallel dreams. One is for the work that we and others do in this arena to have the kind of global impact that we all aspire to and really transform, I think, three major institutions in our culture. I've talked about education and healthcare, and the third that I think is business. And I've actually been hanging out a lot with the dean of our School of Business, who happens to be a visionary. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in workplace, corporate settings to do this and to use corporate settings as a testing ground, both in terms of the impact on job performance, but also on healthcare issues there. My other dream is to have a center for contemplative science where we bring that's truly interdisciplinary, that brings scholars in the humanities, religious scholars, Buddhist scholars, and scientists of different stripes, and practitioners who are delivering these kinds of interventions, and to concentrate this effort and to deploy it in a really powerful way. I think that we have now the tools, we have the kind of questions that need to be asked, and if we had those resources to really do it in a way which we know could be much more impactful than what we're doing now. There are many studies that we have going on now which are they're not the best studies that we could be doing, and we know that. And we can't do the best studies because of resource limitations. And so if we had this, I think that it can be potentially much more impactful.
Any contraindications for meditation? I've heard schizophrenia might be such.
Yeah, so contraindications for meditation, I would say yes, there are some. I definitely think that individuals with certain kinds of severe psychiatric disorders, including schizophrenia, maybe also bipolar disorder, certain kinds of personality disorders. I think that whenever someone asks me about that, I refer them to people who are mental health professionals who are also long-term meditation practitioners. Unfortunately, there are very few of those people, but there are a few, and those are the people that I think should be trying this, because it needs to be done by someone who's expert in both domains. There are case reports in the scientific literature of deleterious effects of meditation in a variety of different groups, including schizophrenics, where it's made things worse. It also potentially in depressed patients who have a lot of rumination, I think it could also be potentially problematic. So I think it needs to be done judiciously.
What's interesting to me, Richie, is that you're looking for determinants of the variability of or capacity to improve your mindfulness through training. And much of that personalized medicine that's moving forward is not phenotypic based, it's genotypic based. So I mean, we're now looking for panels of single nucleotide polymorphisms and copy number variations. In fact, copy number variations that Steve Schurer and Sick Kids has shown clearly correlate with autism spectrum disorder, anxiety, bipolar. Many of the neurodegenerative and psychiatric conditions are genomic based. And so presumably some of those polymorphisms actually predict what type of meditation you should do.
Again, let me express my skepticism for the following reason. I mean, we're doing a lot of genetic research also, but I mean, for those of you who are not familiar with this terminology, a single nucleotide polymorphism, or SNP, is a particular allelic variant of a gene, and some of these have functional consequences, and some of them have been identified with certain kinds of disorders. The amount of variance that any SNP accounts for is minuscule, absolutely minuscule. And in the case of autism, it's likely that there are hundreds of genes that contribute. It's not a single gene or even 10 that are strongly contributing. And so I don't think that there'll be a panel of SNPs that will predict, this or that about one's skill in certain kinds of meditation practice. And it's also the case that many of the associations between single nucleotide polymorphisms and certain kinds of neuropsychiatric diseases are enormously difficult to replicate. And most of them in the extant literature have, if you scrutinize the scientific literature, you'll see as many non-replications as hits. So it's a very complicated area. My own view is that what's going to be much more interesting and where the action is going to be is in epigenetics. And epigenetics refers to the regulation of our genes, and we know that you can think of there being a volume control on each gene. And we're all born with a fixed complement of DNA, which is essentially not going to change, but what does change is the extent to which a gene is expressed. And that's something that I think we're going to get a lot of traction with. That's where I think some of the most exciting basic research is going to go. And there are all kinds of new techniques now. One of the limitations that we've had is that gene expression varies by tissue type. And in humans, we're interested, particularly in this area, in what's going on in the brain. We can't take a brain biopsy. But what we can do now for the very first time, this sounds like science fiction, but it's really true and it's really being done. You can take a skin cell from a person, just scrape a little skin, and then you can convert that the skin fibroblast into a pluripotent stem cell. And once it's in the stem cell stage, you can turn it into any kind of brain cell, any kind of neuron you want. And then the expression patterns that that cell shows when it's in the neuronal stage are totally different than what it showed in the skin fibroblast stage. And you can actually look at gene expression in the brain from a skin cell. It's wild. So we're actually doing that now for the first time. I think that this next few years is going to usher in all kinds of crazy new techniques that will reveal a lot of interesting things.
Dr. Davidson, when you say meditation, are you perhaps also including somatically based practices like mindful yoga, even into Qigong and Tai Chi? Does that figure in there at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'm sort of using the term meditation as a heuristic placeholder for this discussion. There are hundreds of different types of meditation, as I'm sure you all know. And there are all these somatic-based practices. We're doing a study now with moderate-term practitioners who are Westerners, who are all living in the United States, and have had a 10-year or more practice. But they live in the world. They're not monks or nuns. They're folks like, I think, probably many of you. And we're collecting a very, very rich data about their practices, their historical practices and what they're doing now, including somatic-based practices. This is providing a corpus where we can go in and actually look to see if you look at two people, both of whom have done the same amount of sitting practice, but one also has a regular hatha yoga practice. Does that make a difference for certain kinds of measures? We don't know the answer to that yet. Nobody knows. One of the problems with this is also that while we're trying to do as good a job as we can, anyone who's done this, I mean, you can go to 10 different yoga studios in Toronto, and I'm sure the kind of practices that you'll experience will be totally different. It's very difficult to capture this in a serious research context. So unless you're delivering the interventions yourself. So it's an ongoing challenge that we struggle with all the time.
So for research purposes, you use a BSR protocol or for meditation research? What kind of protocol do you use?
For the work we do on meditation, it varies tremendously depending upon what study. So sometimes we've looked at MBSR, other times we've looked at compassion-based practices. There are studies that we're doing now that involve looking at analytic meditation from the Tibetan tradition. There are studies that focus on mindfulness of the body. So all kinds of different.
Can't standardize then their research, like the research, like there's so many different techniques.
It's a big problem, and I think that scientists need to write a method section where they're very, very explicit and precise about what it is, what kinds of practices that they're studying, and that's not always been done. So we're developing now an assessment tool to assess lifetime practice that involves, it's like a structured interview that we do. And once it's finalized, we'll make it available to the research community that will comprehensively go through every known kind of practice and try to quantify how much are people doing it, at what stages in their practice life have they done it, and so forth, so that we can have some standardized corpus. Okay. I'm sure this can go on all evening, so I have no idea what the schedule is, so I'm at the...
We have 3 minutes, about 3 minutes.
Okay.
So I'm a psychotherapist, and I find it very helpful to refer to some of the research for people who are dealing with depression or anxiety, considering mindfulness, to be able to tell them about what's actually possibly going to change in their brains, even 15 minutes a day for a few weeks. Excuse me. I'm just curious if you know of any kind of upcoming studies that are exciting in this area that will help us continue to inform our patients and clients of the benefits of mindfulness and mental health.
You know, there are so many studies coming out now. If you look at a graph of the publications just using the keyword mindfulness, there's a meteoric rise. So, and you know, I'm someone who I think is really very much sitting at the center of this, and I don't know about every new paper that's coming out. So, it's hard to answer your question. I think that there's a lot of cool stuff that's coming out. We just recently published a paper on pain, which I think is very informative about how mindfulness may transform a person's response to pain, because we're specifically looking at the following. This is a laboratory study where it involves heat pain, which is extremely realistic. I mean, it's a burning pain. And we present a cue to a person, and we tell them in 10 seconds you're going to get zapped with this painful stimulus, and they had an experience of this, so they know what's coming. When you do this with most people who are not trained in mindfulness, this moment you present the cue and you tell them that in 10 seconds you're going to get this painful stimulus, the entire machinery in the brain that we know is involved in processing pain begins to activate. And also the body starts to activate. The moment the cue, it's just a simple tone. It's not, and that activates the entire pain matrix. And it turns out that people's reports of suffering is highly correlated with the activity in the brain during this anticipatory period, not during the period when the actual painful stimulus is presented. And if you look at long-term meditation practitioners, they show a big response when the pain actually occurs, but there's virtually no response in the anticipation period, and then the recovery is extremely rapid. So it's like a very sharp inverted V, whereas most other people show this really broad response where they're activating all this stuff in anticipation. So I think that this is providing some useful information about the nature of anticipation and the ways in which that can hijack us. Okay.
I was curious to know the differences that you're noticing between short periods of meditation and what qualities are being developed versus long periods of meditation, and if they're different.
We don't know at this point in time. Those studies have never been done. So these are all just conjectures about this. You know, we're beginning to explore this in some of the work we're doing with children, but it's never been studied systematically, so we just don't know.
And the other thing that I was curious, oh, there's someone else?
We're out of time.
Okay.
Thank you all.